Imagine this. It's late evening on a rural highway. Headlights stream past in both directions. Trucks roar by. On both sides of the road, there's nothing but dark trees and the occasional lonely streetlight. And then, right in the middle of all this movement, there's a car. A black sedan is sitting at an angle by the concrete divider. The headlights are still on. The doors are closed. Inside, there's a wallet, a driver's license, a phone. Everything is in place, except for one thing. There is no driver. A few hours earlier, several people had called 911 about that same car. They said it was drifting from lane to lane, like whoever was behind the wheel wasn't fully in control. One driver watched it bump the barrier and roll to a stop. Another swore he saw a tall man jump out of the passenger side and run along the median, straight toward the trees. No police officer ever saw that man. No one saw him get picked up. No one saw him come back out of the woods. And no one has seen him in the years since. This is the story of a 20-year-old named Ethan Morrison, who left his grandmother's house one ordinary morning, drove out of his small hometown, and never came back. A case with no confirmed crime scene, no body, no final answer. A case that turned into a local legend, an online mystery, and a permanent question mark for one small family. If you like long, atmospheric deep dives into unsolved cases, get comfortable. We're going to walk through this story from the very beginning. Ethan Morrison grew up in a town called Bridgeview in the northern part of Oregon. On a map, Bridgeview is the kind of place you might fly over without noticing. A few schools, a strip mall, gas stations, a couple of churches, and one main road that leads to the bigger city where people go for work, college, or shopping. But for Ethan, Bridgeview was a whole world. The small house where he grew up, the local football field where he ran drills until it got dark, the quiet streets where he rode his bike as a kid. He lived with his grandmother, Grace. Grace had stepped in when Ethan's mother, Liz, couldn't give him a stable home. Liz lived nearby and was still in his life, but her situation was always changing. Jobs, relationships, apartments. Grace was the steady one. Same breakfast every morning, a tidy house, and rules that didn't depend on her mood. Neighbors knew Ethan as Grace's quiet boy. Tall, thin, soft features, careful smile. In high school, he ended up on the football team, partly because of his height, partly because in towns like Bridgeview, if you're even remotely athletic, someone is going to push you toward sports. For a while, that was his identity. Practice after school, games under the lights, bus rides to neighboring towns, the sound of the crowd, even if it was just parents and classmates on metal bleachers. Teachers liked him. He wasn't top of the class, but he did enough to get by. He wasn't a troublemaker. He turned in his work, showed up, and stayed mostly under the radar. If you'd asked most adults in town about him at the time, they probably would have said something like, "He's a good kid, quiet, polite, one of the better ones." He had a younger half-sister, Kayla, who moved back and forth between their mom's place and Grace's house. They fought over little things, the TV remote, who used the bathroom too long, but they also shared that unspoken loyalty you get from growing up side by side in the same complicated family. From the outside, it looked almost boringly normal. And that's exactly what makes everything that happened later so disturbing. Underneath that quiet surface, Ethan's sense of self was a lot more complicated. He was biracial. His father, who was never really in the picture, was black. His mother and grandmother were white. In a small town where most people looked very similar, he stood out, in class photos, in the locker room, on the field. When you're a little kid, you don't usually think about that. But as you get older, you start to notice the lingering looks, the harmless jokes, the questions that would never be asked if you looked like everyone else. Ethan didn't experience some huge, dramatic bullying storyline. It was more subtle than that. But over time, it made him feel like he never fully belonged anywhere. At the same time, he was dealing with the normal stuff everyone goes through around that age. What am I going to do with my life? Am I supposed to leave this town? What if I leave and fail, and end up right back here? One of his history teachers saw potential in him and talked to him about college, about getting a degree, living in a dorm, seeing more of the world than the few streets around his house. For a kid like Ethan, that idea was both exciting and terrifying. Because leaving Bridgeview didn't just mean moving to a new place. It meant proving something, to himself and to everyone who'd ever said, "You're going to go far." He actually did it. He got into a regional university about 3 hours away. Grace was ridiculously proud. She kept his acceptance letter pinned to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a football. She told neighbors, "He's going off to college. He's not going to be stuck here like the rest of us." For the first month or two, it felt like the movies. New dorm, new campus, new people. No one knew who he had been in Bridgeview. That gave him a chance to reinvent himself, at least in theory. In practice, it didn't go like that. Classes were tougher than he expected. Professors weren't impressed just because he showed up. Assignments piled up faster than he could process them. On top of that, the social scene was different. In high school, he'd had a defined role. The quiet football guy, Grace's grandson, part of a small community. On campus, he was just another student walking across a crowded quad. He tried. He went to a few parties. He talked to people in his classes. But a lot of it felt shallow, and the gap between how he thought college would feel and how it actually felt kept growing. He started smoking weed more often, at first to relax, then to turn his brain down, to stop thinking so much about everything all at once. Toward the end of his first year, the pressure got heavier. His grades weren't terrible, but they weren't great. He felt behind, even when he wasn't technically failing. Phone calls home changed tone. Instead of, "It's great, I'm meeting people," it became, "I don't know if this is really for me," or, "I thought I'd feel different here." Eventually, he did what a lot of young people quietly do. He packed up and moved back home. On paper, it was just a break. Realistically, it felt like a step backward he wasn't sure he could explain to anyone, including himself. Back in Bridgeview, everything was familiar. His old room, his old bedspread, the same creaky step on the stairs, coffee brewing in the kitchen at the same time every morning. Ethan picked up a part-time job in a local store. Sometimes he helped out in a warehouse. Sometimes he gave people rides for gas money. From the outside, this looked like a normal figuring things out stage. Lots of 20-year-olds move back in with family for a while. It's not unusual. But inside, Ethan felt like the world had moved on without him. His former classmates had new cities, new majors, new social circles. They posted photos from dorm rooms, concert venues, late-night diners. Their lives seemed to be moving forward, frame by frame. Ethan's life felt like it had frozen. He was back where he'd started. Same town, same house. Only now, with this uncomfortable layer of the guy who left and then came back. Grace noticed he was more withdrawn. Some nights he sat in the living room and watched TV with her like old times. Other nights, he disappeared into his room, shut the door, and stayed there for hours. He started saying he needed to figure himself out. He didn't spell out what that meant. He hinted that he felt stuck between identities, not fully belonging in Bridgeview anymore, but not thriving at university either, not fully at home in either world. Grace did what most loving grandparents would do. She told him he had time, that plenty of people take a while to find their path, that there was nothing shameful about changing directions. He listened, he nodded, and then he went back to sitting with his thoughts, alone. As the days went by, small changes started adding up. About a week before he disappeared, Ethan became more secretive. He would take the car and drive off with no clear reason, returning a few hours later. When asked where he'd been, he shrugged. Just driving. He spent more time on his phone, texting, scrolling, deleting messages as soon as he'd sent them. Kayla remembers glancing over once or twice and seeing him clear entire threads, like he didn't want anyone to even know who he'd been talking to. He mentioned to someone in passing that he'd found something important online, that he had a plan. No one really took that seriously. It sounded like the kind of vague statement a lot of anxious young people make. Looking back, those little details feel like pieces of a puzzle that might never be fully assembled. The morning he disappeared started quietly. Late April 2017. Cool air. That kind of pale morning light that makes everything look a little washed out. Grace was in the kitchen making breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, coffee. Same routine she'd been doing for years. Ethan came downstairs a bit later than usual. He looked like someone who had gotten ready too quickly and thought too much. He told her he'd had an epiphany, that he finally understood what he needed to do with his life. He didn't give a clear explanation. He used phrases like, "I finally get it now," and "I know what I have to do." They weren't the most comforting words coming from someone as unsettled as Ethan. But Grace was running late. She had a bus to catch. She told him, "We'll talk properly tonight, okay? Don't do anything big before we've sat down and gone through it." He said, "Yeah, it's going to be okay." Then he leaned over, kissed her on the cheek, something he hadn't done in a while, and smiled, almost apologetically. Those were the last words she heard from him. Years later, she would still replay that moment and say, "He was clearly carrying something inside him, and I was looking at the clock. I honestly believed we had plenty of time. You always think you have at least one more conversation." After she left, the house fell into that strange morning quiet. The TV mumbling in an empty room, a mug with a ring of coffee at the bottom, a chair pulled out from the table. Ethan stayed a while, scrolling through his phone, flicking between apps like he was searching for something he couldn't find. Then he went back upstairs, grabbed his jacket and his keys, and walked out the front door. He did not leave a note. He did not say he was going to meet anyone. He did not say goodbye. What we know next comes from cell tower pings and a few security cameras. Ethan drove toward the center of town. A traffic camera caught his black sedan at a familiar intersection. Another camera at a gas station saw him pass without stopping. It looked like he did a few loops through Bridgeview, heading north, then south, almost like he was circling the idea of leaving without committing to it. Eventually, he took the on-ramp onto Highway 47. Highway 47 cuts through hills and wooded areas, past scattered neighborhoods and small businesses. On that day, traffic was pretty normal. Rush hour lightening up, people heading home, trucks doing their routes. According to phone data, his signal moved south for a while. Then it switched direction, heading back toward the town. Then south again. That back and forth pattern is one of the most haunting details in this story. It's easy to imagine him gripping the steering wheel, talking to himself in his head. Do I turn around? Do I keep going? Do I actually do this? Was he on his way to see someone? Was he stalling, scared to go through with whatever his plan was? Was he simply driving until he ran out of thoughts? We can only guess. What we have are the facts. His phone moved up and down that highway. At some point, it stopped. That afternoon, the 911 calls began. The first caller reported a black sedan stopped awkwardly near the center divider. It didn't look like a normal breakdown. It looked like the car had drifted, and then just given up. Soon, more calls followed. Different drivers described similar things. A black sedan moving oddly, almost floating across lanes. A slow slide toward the barrier. A gentle impact rather than a high-speed crash. One man said he watched as the car finally came to a stop. He saw a door open. He thought it was the passenger side. and a tall figure stepped out and started running along the median before cutting sharply toward the trees. He couldn't see the person's face. He noticed a light-colored top, dark pants, and then it was over. The figure disappeared into the surroundings, and traffic swallowed the moment. By the time patrol officers got there, the mysterious runner was gone. All that remained was the car. The doors were closed. The engine was off. There was minor damage to the bumper and a scrape on the divider. Nothing major. Inside the car, officers found Ethan's wallet, his driver's license, his phone, and some everyday personal items. It looked less like someone had been in a serious accident, and more like someone had simply stepped out and vanished. At that exact moment, there was no official record of Ethan being missing, no report, no alert. Nothing to connect the strange abandoned car with a young man whose family was starting to worry. So the officers on the scene treated it like what they saw all the time, an abandoned vehicle on a busy road. They called a tow truck. The sedan was taken to an impound lot. Paperwork was filed. The call was closed. Only later, too late to preserve that interior properly, would anyone realize that they had just casually removed what might have been the most important crime scene in the entire case. Back in Bridgeview, the hours ticked by. When Ethan didn't come home that evening, Grace tried not to panic. She told herself he might be with his mom or crashing at a friend's place. His phone was going straight to voicemail, then ringing, then dying again. She texted him, "Where are you?" No reply. She told herself she would yell at him when he walked in, and then hug him. The next morning, he still wasn't there. She started calling around. Liz hadn't seen him. Kayla hadn't heard from him. Friends gave unsure answers. "I think I saw him last week. Maybe a few days ago, not sure." By the third day, fear overcame denial. Grace walked into the police station and filed a missing person report. That's when two separate pieces of information finally collided. A missing 20-year-old named Ethan Morrison and a black sedan with his name on the registration found abandoned on Highway 47. When officers told Grace that his car had already been found days earlier, sitting alone by the divider, she later said it felt like the floor fell out from under her. She had come to say, "He's missing," and they had answered, "So is his car, and has been for a while." Once the connection was made, detectives went to the impound lot. The lot itself was a depressing sight. Rows of cars in various states of damage and neglect, oil stains, bits of broken glass, old leaves stuck in corners. Ethan's sedan was just one more vehicle in the lineup. The interior still contained his belongings. Nothing obviously screamed crime scene. No blood, no shattered glass, no bullet holes. But by then, the car had already been handled by multiple people: tow truck operators, lot workers, maybe even other officers. Doors had been opened and closed. The steering wheel had been touched. Seats might have been adjusted. Whatever microscopic traces could have told the story of who had been in that car with him, if anyone, were almost certainly compromised. One detective later admitted that this decision, not locking down the car from the very start, is the part of the case that haunts him the most. He said he didn't realize, standing in that noisy impound yard, that he'd be thinking about that scene over and over years later, wondering, did we miss something under the floor mat? Was there a fiber, a smudge, a fingerprint that could have changed everything? At that point, though, they had to work with what they had. And what they had was a missing young man, a strange abandoned car, and a highway surrounded by trees. The search effort that followed was intense. Officers went back to the stretch of Highway 47 where the car had stopped. They walked the shoulder. They peered into the ditch. They stepped just inside the tree line, calling his name. Search and rescue teams were called in. Volunteers showed up in boots and jackets, some of them friends of Ethan's, some of them people who'd barely met him, some of them complete strangers who just didn't like the idea of a kid disappearing on their local road. They divided into small groups and walked side by side through the woods, trying to keep the distance between them consistent so they wouldn't miss anything. They were told not to touch anything suspicious, to flag it and call it in. Search dogs were run through the area. Given Ethan's scent from his clothes, they pulled forward, noses low to the ground, weaving among fallen branches and brush. For the first day or two, there was still a sense of, we might find him any minute. Maybe he'd fallen, hit his head, and had been lying somewhere, waiting to be found. Maybe he was confused, scared, but alive. As hours turned into full days, that hope slowly transformed into something heavier and more complicated. On the second and third days, they widened the search grid. They split the area into numbered squares on a map, marked off what they had already covered, sent teams into the new sections. They returned over and over to that original stretch of highway where the car had stopped, just in case they'd overlooked a crucial detail the first time. They didn't find his body. They didn't find his clothes. They didn't find any obvious sign of a struggle. There were false leads. A gray hoodie found in the woods that turned out not to be his. A faint trail that a dog started following before losing it completely. A supposed sighting of a young man who looked like him at a gas station miles away, which security footage didn't really support. Every time someone said, "We might have something," the family's hearts jumped. Every time it turned out to be nothing, they hit the ground a little harder. While the official search slowly wound down, because it always does, eventually, when there's nothing new to work with, the emotional part of the story was only getting started. Kayla created an online page dedicated to finding Ethan. She posted photos of him at different ages, a kid on a bike, a teenager in a football jersey, a slightly older version of him with tired eyes, and that same shy smile. Grace, who had always preferred to stay in the background, agreed to sit in front of TV cameras and answer questions she didn't have answers to. "If you know anything," she said again and again, "if you've seen him, please call. We just want to know he's alive. Or, we just want to know." On camera, she seemed composed. Between takes, when the microphones were off, she stared at the floor or twisted her hands in her lap. Sometime after the disappearance, while going through Ethan's things, Kayla found one of his old notebooks. Most of it was boring. Math notes, to-do lists, random doodles. But a few pages were different. They were filled with short sentences and fragments, written in a faster, messier version of his handwriting. "I don't know who I am in this story. Too many expectations, not enough air. If I just walked away, who would it really hurt?" Sitting on the floor of his room, holding that notebook, she understood just how far inside his own head he'd gone. Their mother, Liz, eventually agreed to one interview. She sat in a chair under studio lights, hands wrapped around a mug she never actually drank from, and said, "I guess I must be the worst mother in the world, because now people only see me through this story. Everyone asks, how could you not know something was wrong with your son? But sometimes, you really don't know. You see that your child is grown. He has his own world. He smiles, says he's fine. You think, well, he has people to talk to besides me. He's not a kid anymore. And then one day you realize you were the last person who should have noticed something was off. And you didn't." She talked about texting him while he was at university. "Hey, how's it going?" His answers. "Good. It's okay. I'll figure it out." She admitted there was a moment when she thought, maybe he really would be better off without me hovering around. My life is a mess. And now that thought haunted her. What if he felt the same about everyone? That everyone would be better off without him? At some point, Ethan's case left the front page and moved to the background. That's what happens to most missing person stories when there's no new development. But it didn't disappear entirely. It stayed alive in 3 places. In Bridgeview, as a quiet, painful local legend. on the internet, as a thread for true crime fans and amateur sleuths to pull on, and inside a handful of people who, for their own reasons, couldn't stop thinking about it. In Bridgeview, teenagers who had been kids when Ethan vanished grew up with the story. Older siblings told younger ones about the guy who disappeared from the highway. Sooner or later, someone turned it into a ghost story. They'd say that on foggy nights, if you drive down Highway 47 and look over at the barrier, you might see the shadow of a tall guy in a light t-shirt standing by the roadside with his back to the cars. Did kids actually see anything? Probably not. But people kept telling the story anyway, because it's easier to picture a ghost standing on the shoulder of the road than it is to accept a real person simply vanishing without a trace. Online, the case found a second life. One of Kayla's friends put together a long post, a timeline, a few photos, the basic facts. He shared it. Local community pages picked it up. It went from there to true crime groups, cold case forums, threads where people trade their favorite unsolved mysteries. Hundreds of comments piled up, some from people who had lost someone themselves and understood the pain without explanation, some from people trying to piece together their own version of what happened, connecting dots between old reports, maps, and online rumors. Some from people who were absolutely certain, with no evidence at all, that Ethan was still alive, living under another name, too ashamed or scared to come home. And then, of course, there were the blame games. Strangers who had never set foot in Bridgeview blamed his mother. Others blamed his grandmother. Others blamed the police. Others blamed drugs, social media, this generation, the system. When a story doesn't have a clear villain, people start sculpting one out of whoever is nearby. In one particularly intense thread, a man claimed he'd driven Highway 47 around that time and seen a black sedan parked on the shoulder even earlier than official reports showed. People dug through old weather records, road construction notices, archived traffic maps, trying to line up the details. They wanted that one new clue that would crack everything open. It didn't come. In the end, his memory didn't lead anywhere definitive. It became just one more maybe on top of a whole pile of maybes. 7 years after the day Ethan disappeared, something happened that everyone had been both quietly dreading and actively expecting. In a neighboring county, deep in a wooded area not far from an old back road, someone found human remains. The early details made it possible, not certain, but possible, that the remains belonged to him. Male, roughly the same height and age, likely dead for several years. Local media ran the story. Within hours, Grace's phone was filled with messages. "Have you seen this? This might be Ethan. Have the police talked to you yet?" Investigators came by and took DNA samples from Grace and from Liz. Then there was nothing anyone could do but wait. It's hard to describe that kind of waiting if you've never experienced it. You're supposed to live your normal life, go to work, buy groceries, do laundry, while a part of your brain just repeats the same question. Is this it? Is this him? Part of you begs, please don't let it be him. Another part whispers, at least then we would finally know. Weeks went by. When the results finally came in, they were delivered in dry, clinical language. The remains did not match Ethan's DNA. They belonged to someone else's son, someone else's brother. A few people told Grace, "See, that's good news. It means he might still be alive." She nodded, because that's what you do. Later, talking to a pastor and then to a therapist, she admitted that what she actually felt was nothing. No joy. No relief. Just a deeper kind of tiredness. Because every time a possible answer turns out not to be your answer, you're dropped back into the same place, that endless hallway between two doors you're never allowed to open. A therapist once said something to her that stuck. As long as someone is officially missing, you're living in two realities at the same time. In one reality, Ethan is dead. In that reality, you are supposed to grieve. Not get over it, but at least begin to build a life around the hole that's been punched in it. In the other reality, he's alive somewhere. Maybe suffering. Maybe trying to come back. Maybe convinced he can't. In that reality, you are not allowed to give up. You keep a light on by the door. You keep your phone with the volume up. You answer every unknown number. The cruel part is, you can't fully live in either of those realities. If you lean too hard into grief, a voice in your head whispers, "What if he walks through that door tomorrow?" If you lean too hard into hope, another voice asks, "How long can you live like this?" So you end up stuck in between, year after year. For the detective who worked Ethan's case in that first year, that limbo took on its own shape. Even as he neared retirement, he found himself occasionally taking a detour on his way home, choosing the route that went along Highway 47 instead of the faster one. He'd slow down a little as he approached the barrier where the car had been found. He'd glance at the trees, at the shoulder, at the open space where that sedan once sat. He knew, rationally, that he wasn't going to suddenly spot a crucial piece of evidence 7 years too late. But his mind still staged the same scene. The black car drifting toward the divider. A young man inside, lost in his thoughts. A door swinging open. A decision being made. Or forced. He said that out of all the cases he'd worked, this was the one that made him wish hardest that he could rewind time by just a couple of days. Not to chase someone down or kick down a door. Just to treat that car on day one like what it turned out to be. The center of a mystery, not just another hazard on the highway. By now, Ethan's case has all the classic elements of a cold case that draws people in. A quiet, relatable main character. A small town. A single strange decision, or series of decisions, that lead to a point of no return. A final, unexplained image. A young man running along a highway and disappearing into the trees. And that's exactly why it's so easy to turn his story into nothing but a puzzle. To sit behind a screen and confidently declare which theory must be true. He definitely had a breakdown. He was definitely murdered. He definitely started a new life and just doesn't want to come back. The truth is, we don't know. All three main theories are possible. All three have holes. The first theory is that Ethan had a severe mental health crisis. Some mix of depression, anxiety, maybe a brief psychotic or dissociative episode. Imagine that version for a second. He's driving up and down the highway, brain spinning so fast that reality starts to feel distant. Maybe he hasn't slept properly. Maybe he's been using weed more than he should. Maybe he's replaying the same thought over and over. I can't go back home like this. I can't go forward like this. I don't belong anywhere. At some point, the car starts drifting. He's not fully present. He bumps the barrier. The shock snaps him partway back, but not enough to make a calm decision. His body goes into flight mode. He opens the door, gets out, and runs. Not because it's logical, not because he has a destination, but because his nervous system is screaming, "Run." If that's what happened, then somewhere off that highway, in the woods, or beyond them, is where his story ended. Search teams may have walked within meters of him and never seen him. Animals, weather, time. They can erase more than we want to believe. Bodies sink into undergrowth. Bones scatter. Clothing fades. It's not a comforting image, but it is possible. The second theory is that someone else was involved, that Ethan met with the wrong people at the wrong time and never had the chance to walk away. This scenario leans on witness accounts of multiple men near the car earlier in the day, and on the simple fact that a young man alone and vulnerable can be an easy target. Maybe he agreed to meet someone about drugs, or money, or a personal dispute. Maybe he picked up a hitchhiker, trying to be helpful. Maybe someone flagged him down, pretending to need assistance. 2 people against 1 is a bad equation. Out on a highway, with trees all around, and no cameras except a few traffic lenses, a confrontation can escalate quickly. In this version, the car is just a prop that gets left behind. Whatever happened to Ethan happened somewhere else. Another vehicle, a hidden spot off a back road, a remote property nobody thinks to search. It's ugly, but we all know stories like that exist. The problem with this theory is evidence. There's no confirmed sign of a struggle, no suspicious DNA, no known enemy. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when the first crucial hours of a case were spent treating the car like a simple broken-down vehicle. The third theory is that Ethan left on purpose, that his epiphany that morning was the decision to erase himself from his old life. He'd been feeling like he didn't belong. He'd come home from college feeling like a failure. He'd been Googling stories about people disappearing, starting over, living off the grid. In this scenario, leaving his wallet, license, and phone in the car was not an accident. It was the point. He steps out of the sedan, walks away from everything that ties him to the identity, Ethan Morrison, and becomes just another anonymous young man on the side of the road. Maybe someone picks him up. Maybe he travels for a while under the radar. Maybe he builds an entirely new life thousands of miles away. People do vanish on purpose. It's not common, but it happens. But here's the catch. A truly clean disappearance is incredibly hard to maintain. You need money, some kind of work, documents eventually, a way to get medical care if you get hurt or sick. You have to avoid every database, every camera that might catch your face and flag it. And you have to live with the knowledge that there's a grandmother sitting at a table somewhere, staring at the door every evening, wondering if you're alive. For some people, that guilt alone would be unbearable. For others, in enough pain, it might feel like the lesser evil. What we do know is that one ordinary morning, a 20-year-old left his house in a small town in Oregon, drove up and down a highway trying to decide something big, and ended up leaving behind a car full of his belongings and a family full of questions. For his grandmother, his mother, his sister, he's not a ghost, not a character, not content. He's just Ethan, the boy who used to leave his shoes in the wrong place, the teenager who grumbled about early practices, the young man who said he'd figured something out, and then never got the chance, or never chose, to explain what that meant. And if he is still out there somewhere, older now, maybe going by another name, maybe working in some small job in some other small town, it's worth remembering this. To the world, he might be nobody. To 3 people in Bridgeview, he is still somebody. If you've stayed with this story all the way to the end, thank you. Cases like this don't come with a satisfying twist or a dramatic confession. They end where they started, with a car on the side of the road and a missing person poster that someone has to decide whether to keep updating or finally take down. Somewhere between the police reports, the theories, the legends, and the silence, there's one unanswered question that everything keeps circling. What really happened on Highway 47 to a young man named Ethan Morrison? You've heard the facts, the context, and the most common theories. Which version do you find most convincing, and why? Let me know what you think. And if you want more long-form deep dives into unsolved cases like this one, you know what to do.